She thought her lies had buried Banker for good, but her daughter grew eyes that remembered the truth. Then one day, that daughter pointed at a photo of her mother's funeral and said, "That's the woman who killed me." What happens when the ghost you betrayed is born through your bloodline? This is not just the end of a story, it's the voice of the dead reclaiming justice. 4 years ago, Banker was betrayed by her best friend and died a horrific, silenced death after a fake job in Abuja. That friend, Amaka, denied ever knowing her, but the dead do not forget. Banker returned through Amaka's newborn daughter, and in part 2, the baby began to speak, not like a child, but like Banker herself. With every word, every scar, every haunting whisper, the truth clawed its way back. Now, in part 3, the world is about to hear it all. This is the final part of the Banker trilogy, where a dead girl's voice speaks through flesh and fury, and finally finds the man who thought she was buried. She thought the nightmares would stop when she turned 15. Instead, they got clearer. Every night the same woman whispered the same words, "He's still breathing." And every morning, Bankola would wake up knowing that somewhere out there, the man who killed her spiritual mother was living free, getting richer, probably destroying more girls. Until the night she saw his face on television, and everything changed. This is the story of how a 15-year-old girl brought down a senator, exposed a trafficking ring, and finally gave her mother's spirit the justice it had been screaming for. This is the end of the Banker trilogy, and the beginning of a reckoning 15 years in the making. Bankola Williams woke up screaming at 3:17 a.m. The same time every night for 3 months. The same dream, the same woman, the same words echoing in her 15-year-old mind like a prayer that wouldn't be answered. "He's still breathing." Her stepmother, Dr. Sarah Williams, rushed into the room with the efficiency of someone who had done this too many times before. She found Bankola sitting up in bed, sweat-soaked, clutching a pencil and frantically sketching on the notepad she now kept on her nightstand. "The same dream again?" Sarah asked gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. Bankola nodded, not looking up from her drawing. Her hand moved with an urgency that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her own will, sketching features she had never seen in real life, but knew as intimately as her own reflection. A man's face, older, distinguished, the kind of face that appeared on magazine covers and political posters. Sharp cheekbones, calculating eyes, a smile that looked generous but felt cruel. "Who is he, Mama Sarah?" Bankola asked, finally looking up from the sketch. "Who is this man that keeps visiting my dreams?" Sarah studied the drawing with growing unease. There was something disturbingly familiar about the face, but she couldn't place it. What worried her more was the skill with which Bankola had captured not just the man's features, but something deeper, something that seemed to radiate menace even from a pencil sketch. "I don't know, baby, but maybe it's time we talk to Pastor Kunle again." They had been to see Pastor Kunle many times over the years. He was the only one who understood Bankola's unique situation. The only one who didn't try to explain away the fact that a child spoke with the wisdom of someone who had lived and died before. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Senator Williams turned on the evening news. He was catching up on political developments, half listening while Sarah and Bankola discussed their day. But when the news anchor's voice filled the dining room, all conversation stopped. "In political news tonight, Chief Omegu has officially announced his bid for the Senate, promising to champion youth development and women's empowerment. The businessman turned politician, who heads the Omegu Foundation for Girls, says his mission is to ensure that no young woman is left behind in Nigeria's march toward progress." The camera cut to a press conference. A distinguished older man stood behind a podium, surrounded by young women in matching t-shirts. His smile was practiced, political. His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to being believed. Bankola's fork clattered to her plate. The face on the television screen was identical to the one she had been drawing for months. "That's him," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. "That's him, Mama Sarah. That's the man I keep seeing." Senator Williams looked at his daughter with concern. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" But Bankola was already standing, backing away from the television, as if the man could see her through the screen. The woman in my dreams. She keeps saying he's still breathing. She keeps showing me his face. And now, she pointed at the screen with a trembling finger. Now I know why. Sarah grabbed the remote and rewound the segment. Chief Omegu's face filled the screen again, and this time there was no mistaking it. The resemblance to Bankola's sketches was perfect, down to the calculated coldness behind his public smile. Bankola, Sarah said carefully, you've never seen this man before, have you? In real life, I mean. But she has. Bankola's voice had changed, taken on the slightly older, more mature tone that always appeared when she was channeling something beyond herself. And she wants me to remember what he did to her. That night, after Senator Williams had gone to bed and Sarah had reluctantly allowed Bankola to stay up late, they sat together in the living room with Pastor Kunle, who had arrived within an hour of their emergency call. Tell me about the dreams, Pastor Kunle said, his voice gentle but serious. Bankola described them in detail. The hotel room, the man's voice offering money, the feeling of betrayal and terror, the physical pain that seemed to echo through her own body, even though she was only witnessing someone else's memories. And you're certain this is the same man? Pastor Kunle asked, studying the sketches Bankola had made over the past 3 months. Completely certain. But Pastor, how is that possible? How can I be dreaming about someone I've never met? Pastor Kunle was quiet for a long moment, studying the drawings with the expression of a man who had seen the impossible too many times to doubt it. Because some debts, he finally said, take more than one lifetime to collect. The story Pastor Kunle told them that night was one he had kept secret for 6 years. Before Chief Omegu became a politician, before he became a businessman, he was just a young man named Tukur, with more ambition than conscience. And like many young men who want power without paying the price for it, he sought alternative methods. Pastor Kunle pulled out an old folder, yellowed with age, containing newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. In 2009, a year before Banker died, there were reports of a young man visiting traditional priests across West Africa. He was looking for what they call life extension rituals, ways to transfer the life force of others into himself. Sarah leaned forward, her medical training making her skeptical, but her experience with Bankola keeping her open to possibilities beyond science. You're talking about ritual killings? I'm talking about something far more sophisticated, not just killing for ritual purposes, but creating a systematic way to harvest what certain practitioners believe to be the soul energy of innocent victims. Young women were particularly prized because their life force was considered purer. Bankola felt a chill run down her spine. The dreams, I see other girls, not just one, multiple hotel rooms, multiple voices. Because there were multiple victims, Banker was not the first. She was simply the one whose spirit refused to be silenced. Pastor Kunle opened another file, this one containing photos that made Sarah gasp and turn away. Over a 5-year period, between 2005 and 2010, more than 30 young women disappeared after attending what were described as modeling jobs or ushering events in major Nigerian cities. All were university students. All came from poor families. All had trusted friends who led them to these opportunities. He pulled out a map with red pins marking locations across Nigeria, Ghana, and Benin. The pattern was always the same. A trusted friend would introduce them to what seemed like a legitimate opportunity. They would travel to an upscale location. They would meet a distinguished older man who would make them an offer that seemed too good to refuse. And then they would disappear, Bankola finished, her voice carrying the weight of memories that weren't her own. Some would return home briefly, appearing to be perfectly fine, even wealthy. But within months, they would develop mysterious illnesses, swelling, infections, conditions that no doctor could explain or treat. And eventually, they would die in ways that defied medical understanding. Sarah's hands were shaking. And you think this man, this Omegu, was responsible? I think he was the beneficiary, the recipient of whatever these rituals were designed to transfer. Look at his rise to power, his accumulation of wealth, his seeming immunity to scandal or consequence. Look at how he has thrived while the families of his victims have suffered. Pastor Kunle pulled out one final document, a photocopy of a handwritten journal entry. This was found among Banker's belongings after her death. Her mother gave it to me, hoping I could make sense of it. The entry was dated 3 days before Banker's trip to Abuja. Something feels wrong about this job, but Amaka says I'm overthinking it. The man organizing it keeps changing his name. First he said he was Mr. Johnson, then Mr. Tukur, then something else entirely. When I asked Amaka about it, she said rich men sometimes use different names for privacy. But it makes me nervous. Why would someone need so much privacy for a simple ushering job? Bankola stared at the page, her hands trembling. Tukur, that's what she calls him in my dreams. Never Omegu, always Tukur. Because that's the name he gave her, the name he was using when he was still small enough to do his own hunting. Now he's big enough to have others do it for him. The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. So what do we do? Sarah asked. How do we stop someone like that? Pastor Kunle looked at Bankola with an expression that was part sadness, part determination. We don't stop him. She does, because some battles can only be fought by those who carry the scars. Bankola felt something shift inside her, like a door opening to a room she had always known was there, but had never been brave enough to enter. The woman in my dreams, she said slowly. She's not just showing me what happened to her. She's showing me what I need to do about it. Yes, but Bankola, you need to understand. This isn't just about justice for Banker anymore. If Pastor Kunle is right, if this man has built his entire life on the deaths of innocent girls, then stopping him could save lives that haven't been lost yet. That night, alone in her room, Bankola opened a new notebook and began to write. Not about her dreams this time, but about plans, about research, about the careful, methodical work of building a case against a man who thought he was untouchable. She wrote until dawn, guided by a voice that whispered strategies in her ear and a determination that felt both entirely her own and borrowed from someone who had died too young to see justice done. Don't worry, Mama Banker, she whispered to the empty room. We're going to find him. And when we do, the whole world is going to know what he did to you. The dreams changed after that night. Instead of the same recurring nightmare, Bankola began experiencing what she could only describe as a guided tour through hell. Each night brought new visions, new victims, new pieces of a puzzle that painted a picture of systematic evil spanning more than a decade. She saw a girl named Kemi from the University of Lagos who had been offered a modeling contract in 2011. She watched through Kemi's eyes as she met the same distinguished man in the same type of luxury hotel suite, heard the same offer delivered in the same smooth voice. She witnessed Funmi from the University of Ibadan, who had been promised a scholarship opportunity in 2012. The location was different, this time a private residence in Victoria Island. But the ending was always the same, and she experienced, with visceral clarity, the final moments of a girl named Adeze from the University of Nigeria, in Nsukka, who had trusted her roommate's recommendation for what was described as a cultural consultation job in 2013. They all thought they were special, Bankola told Sarah and Pastor Kunle during one of their increasingly frequent emergency meetings. They all thought they were the only ones, but he had a system, a network. She had begun keeping detailed notes, sketching not just faces but locations, documenting the methods used to lure each victim, mapping out what appeared to be a sophisticated operation designed to identify and harvest vulnerable young women. The hotels are all part of the same chain, she said, spreading her drawings across Pastor Kunle's desk. And the friends who made the introductions, they all received money afterward, substantial amounts. Sarah studied the sketches with growing horror. You're describing human trafficking on an industrial scale, with a spiritual component that made it invisible to law enforcement, Pastor Kunle added. Who investigates ritual killings when the victims appear to die of natural causes months later? But that's not all, Bankola said, her voice taking on the distant quality that indicated she was accessing memories that weren't her own. The operation didn't end in 2013. It evolved. She pulled out a fresh sketch, this one showing a modern office building with a distinctive architectural design. After the death started attracting attention, they changed tactics. Instead of direct recruitment, they created legitimate-looking opportunities. Scholarship programs, essay contests, leadership academies, all designed to identify and evaluate potential targets before making direct contact. Sarah felt sick. You're saying they turned philanthropy into a hunting ground. I'm saying they turned their crimes into a brand, and the man responsible has built a political career on the reputation of helping young women achieve their dreams. Pastor Kunli was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Bankola, these visions you're having, they're not just memories, they're evidence, but evidence that could never be presented in any court. Then we don't use the courts, we use something more powerful. What's more powerful than the law? Bankola looked up from her sketches, and for a moment her eyes held the accumulated wisdom and rage of every girl who had died screaming in a luxury hotel room. The truth, told in a way that can't be ignored, can't be silenced, and can't be forgotten. That weekend, Bankola convinced her parents to let her spend Saturday at the National Library, ostensibly working on a school research project. Instead, she spent 8 hours combing through newspaper archives, cross-referencing missing person reports with dates and locations from her visions. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Between 2005 and 2012, there had been 43 cases of university-age women who had disappeared temporarily, only to return home with mysterious wealth and die within 6 months of unexplained medical conditions. The deaths had occurred across 6 different states, but the pattern was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. More disturbing was what she found in the business records. Every location where the initial contacts had been made was either owned by or connected to a shell company that traced back to Chief Omegu's business empire. The hotels, the private residences, even some of the universities where the victims had been students, all had received donations or investments from companies in his network. He wasn't just killing them, Bankola told her parents that evening. He was studying them, learning how to identify and approach the most vulnerable targets, building a database of successful recruitment strategies. Senator Williams, who had been skeptical of his daughter's supernatural experiences but couldn't argue with her research skills, looked at the documents she had compiled with professional interest. This is sophisticated intelligence gathering, the kind of operation that requires significant resources and careful coordination. Which explains why he was never caught, Sarah added. He wasn't operating like a serial killer. He was operating like a corporation. And now he wants to be a senator, Bankola said, her voice carrying a cold determination that made her parents exchange worried glances. He wants to use the same skills that made him a successful predator to make him a successful politician. She spread out her final sketch, a detailed organizational chart showing connections between Omegu's various businesses, the locations where crimes had occurred, and the timing of his political rise. But there's one thing he didn't account for when he built his empire on dead girls. What's that? Pastor Kunli asked. Bankola's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Dead girls don't forget. And sometimes they get daughters who know how to fight back. The plan came together with the kind of precision that suggested divine intervention, though Bankola preferred to think of it as concentrated rage with excellent organizational skills. She had convinced her parents to let her participate in a Model United Nations conference in Abuja, scheduled for the same weekend as the grand opening of Chief Omegu's new foundation headquarters. The timing was not coincidental. Bankola had spent weeks researching his public appearances, looking for an opportunity to get close enough to confirm what her dreams had shown her. I'm not comfortable with this, Sarah said for the 10th time as they drove toward Abuja. We're talking about a potentially dangerous man, and you want to… What? Confront him at a public event? I want to see his face when he looks at me, Bankola replied, her voice steady. I want to know if he recognizes what he's looking at. Senator Williams glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror. And what exactly would he be looking at? The consequence he thought he had buried. They had agreed on a compromise. Bankola would attend the MUN conference as planned, but if she wanted to observe Omegu's event, she would do so from a safe distance with her parents nearby. No direct contact, no confrontation, just observation. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The MUN conference was being held at a hotel less than 2 miles from Omegu's foundation headquarters. As Bankola sat through a debate about international human trafficking policies, the irony was not lost on her. She felt a familiar tugging sensation, like an invisible hand pulling her toward something important. During the lunch break, she excused herself to the bathroom, but instead made her way to the hotel's upper floor, following an impulse she couldn't explain but didn't question. From the window at the end of the hallway, she had a perfect view of Chief Omegu's compound. And there, hanging in the windows of what appeared to be his private residence, were the blue curtains from her dreams. The sight hit her like a physical blow. For months, she had been seeing those curtains in her visions. Thick, royal blue fabric with a subtle gold pattern, hanging in a room where terrible things happened. She had sketched them dozens of times, but seeing them in reality made the dreams feel suddenly, viscerally real. You see them too. Bankola spun around to find a young woman standing behind her, maybe 22 or 23 years old, wearing the uniform of hotel staff. I'm sorry? The blue curtains. You see them, don't you? In your dreams. Bankola's blood turned to ice. How do you know that? The woman stepped closer, and Bankola could see that her eyes held the same haunted quality that sometimes looked back at her from mirrors. Because I used to clean that room. Before I got smart enough to quit. Before I realized what those curtains had witnessed. What's your name? Grace Okoro, and I know who you are, even though we've never met. How? Grace smiled sadly. Because I've been dreaming about you for 2 years. A young girl with an old soul coming to finish what was started. The other girls, they talk about you. They say you're the one who's going to make it right. The conversation that followed changed everything. Grace had worked at the hotel that serviced Omegu's events for 3 years, from 2013 to 2016. She had been assigned to the VIP floor, where the most important guests stayed and where the most private meetings took place. I saw things, she said simply, young women who arrived excited and left different, changed. Some never left at all, at least not alive. Why didn't you report it? Report what? That I had a feeling. That I thought something wasn't right. You have to understand, these were powerful men, politicians, businessmen. The kind of people who could make a hotel worker disappear without anyone asking questions. But you're talking to me now. Because now there's someone who might actually be able to do something about it. Someone who has help. Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital camera. I couldn't report what I saw, but I could document it. Every face, every license plate, every detail that seemed important. I've been waiting for the right person to give this to. She pressed the camera into Bankola's hands. That room with the blue curtains. It's not just where he met with girls, it's where he keeps records, files, photographs, everything he needs to remember which rituals were successful and which victims provided the best results. Bankola's hands were shaking. You're telling me there's evidence. I'm telling you there's an archive, a catalogue of 15 years of systematic murder organized like a business ledger. Names, dates, methods, outcomes, everything you would need to prove what he's been doing. How do you know all this? Grace's expression darkened. Because he tried to recruit me too, in 2016, when I was struggling to pay for my mother's medical bills. He offered me money to help him interview potential scholarship recipients, young women who were desperate enough to trust a stranger with a kind smile and a generous offer. But you said no. I said yes. At first, I needed the money and he made it sound so innocent. Just help evaluate applications, conduct preliminary interviews, identify the most promising candidates. Grace paused, her voice becoming softer. It wasn't until I saw what happened to the first girl I helped him select that I understood what I had really agreed to. Her name was Blessing. She was 18 years old and wanted to be a doctor. 3 months after their interview, she was dead. And that's when you started documenting everything. That's when I realized that someone needed to remember their names. Someone needed to keep a record of who they were before he turned them into statistics. Bankola looked down at the camera in her hands, understanding that she was holding more than evidence. She was holding the accumulated hopes and dreams and final breaths of dozens of young women who had died believing they were alone. Grace, I need to get into that room. I was hoping you'd say that, because tomorrow night he's hosting a private dinner for potential political donors. The security will be focused on the main event, and I still have friends on the cleaning staff. You're talking about breaking into a private residence. I'm talking about retrieving stolen property, those files, those photographs, those records. They belong to the families of the girls he killed. We'd just be returning them to their rightful owners. That evening, Bankola called an emergency meeting with her parents and Pastor Kunle. She showed them the camera, shared Grace's story, and outlined what she believed was their best chance to gather concrete evidence against Chief Omegu. Absolutely not, Senator Williams said immediately. You're talking about breaking and entering, about putting yourself in direct danger with a man we believe to be a serial killer. I'm talking about the only chance we'll ever have to prove what he's done and prevent him from doing it again. Bankola, there has to be another way. Pastor Kunle, who had been silent throughout her presentation, finally spoke. Sometimes God places us in impossible situations because impossible situations require impossible solutions. This man has spent over 6 years operating beyond the reach of conventional justice. Perhaps it's time for unconventional justice. Sarah looked at him in surprise. You're endorsing this? I'm recognizing that some battles cannot be won through proper channels because the people who control those channels are either compromised or powerless. If Grace is right, if there really are files documenting decades of systematic murder, then obtaining those files could save lives. Senator Williams ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Bankola recognized as his way of processing stress. And if you're caught? If something goes wrong? If this man realizes what you're trying to do? Bankola met her father's eyes with a steadiness that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her 15 years. Then at least the girls he killed will know that someone tried to fight for them. At least their families will know the truth. And at least the girls he hasn't killed yet will have a chance. The room fell silent as the weight of the decision settled over them. Finally, Sarah spoke. If we do this, and I'm not saying we should, but if we do this, we do it right. Professional equipment, backup plans, exit strategies. Senator Williams looked at his wife in amazement. You're actually considering this? I'm considering the fact that our daughter has been chosen for something larger than we can understand. And sometimes, when you're chosen for something, the only real choice is whether to do it well or do it poorly. Bankola felt a wave of gratitude and terror in equal measure. So we're really going to do this? Pastor Kunle smiled grimly. We're going to try to do what 15 years of law enforcement and investigation couldn't accomplish. We're going to make the dead speak loud enough for the living to hear. That night, for the first time in months, Bankola didn't dream about the blue curtains. Instead, she dreamed about justice. The opportunity came 3 weeks later, delivered in a crisp white envelope bearing the embossed seal of the Omegu Foundation for Girls. You have been selected as a finalist for the Chief Omegu Excellence in Leadership Award, one of Nigeria's most prestigious scholarships for young women. Bankola stared at the letter, her hands trembling slightly. She had applied for dozens of scholarships over the past month, casting as wide a net as possible, but she had never expected this particular fish to bite. The final selection process will take place during our annual gala dinner, where you will have the opportunity to present your vision for women's empowerment to our distinguished panel of judges. Sarah read over her daughter's shoulder, her medical training immediately focusing on the practical implications. They want you to attend an event where he'll be present, where you'll be expected to interact with him directly, where I'll have the perfect cover story for being there and the perfect opportunity to get close to him, Bankola corrected. The gala was scheduled for the following Saturday at the newly opened Omegu Foundation headquarters in Abuja, the same building where Grace had worked, the same building with the blue curtains. Senator Williams studied the invitation with professional interest. This is a high-profile event. Government officials, business leaders, media coverage. If something goes wrong at a public event with media coverage, it goes wrong very publicly. which means he can't make me disappear without answering uncomfortable questions. Pastor Kunle had been unusually quiet since the invitation arrived. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made everyone pay attention. I've been praying about this since we first discussed your mission, and I keep receiving the same answer, which is that this invitation didn't come to you by accident, that your application wasn't selected by chance, that everything that's happening now is part of a larger plan that began 15 years ago with a girl named Banker who refused to let her death be meaningless. Bankola felt the familiar tingling sensation that indicated she was channeling something beyond her own thoughts. She knew, she said in a voice that sounded older than her years. When she was dying, when her body was failing, she knew that justice wouldn't come through traditional means, so she found another way. What do you mean? She made sure that her story would survive, that her memories would be preserved, that someone would eventually come along with the ability to see what she had seen and the courage to do what she couldn't. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. You're saying she chose you before you were even born. I'm saying that some debts are paid across lifetimes, and some justice takes longer than a single human existence to achieve. The week leading up to the gala was a whirlwind of preparation. Bankola worked with a speech coach, courtesy of Senator Williams' connections, to perfect her presentation. She met with Grace twice more to finalize their plan for accessing Omegu's private files, and she spent long hours with Pastor Kunle, preparing spiritually for what they all understood might be a dangerous confrontation. Remember, Pastor Kunle told her the night before the event, you're not going there to seek revenge. You're going there to seek truth. Revenge is about destruction. Truth is about restoration. What if he recognizes me? What if he somehow knows who I am? Then you'll be ready for him, because the spirit that guides you has been preparing for this confrontation longer than he's been preparing to avoid it. The gala itself was exactly what Bankola had expected, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and philanthropy designed to showcase Chief Owumi as a champion of women's rights and youth development. The ballroom was filled with politicians, business leaders, and representatives from various charitable organizations. Young women in formal gowns moved through the crowd, each one a scholarship recipient or program participant, living proof of the foundation's impact. Bankola wore a simple black dress and carried a small clutch that contained Grace's digital camera, a voice recorder, and a copy of Banker's journal. Everything she needed to document whatever she might discover. Miss Williams. She turned to find a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile approaching her. I'm Mrs. Adebayo, the Foundation's program coordinator. We're so excited to have you here tonight. Chief Owumi has been particularly interested in your application. Your essay on justice delayed but not denied was quite powerful. Bankola's pulse quickened. He read my essay. Oh yes, he reads all the finalist applications personally. He said your perspective on restorative justice was unusually mature for someone your age. He's looking forward to meeting you. As if summoned by their conversation, Chief Owumi appeared at Mrs. Adebayo's side. In person, he was exactly as Bankola's dreams had shown him. Distinguished, charismatic, with the kind of presence that commanded attention and inspired trust. Miss Williams, he said, extending his hand with a politician's practiced warmth, I've been looking forward to this meeting. The moment their hands touched, Bankola felt an electric shock of recognition. This was the hand that had touched Banker, the voice that had made her the offer that destroyed her life, the smile that had been the last thing dozens of young women had seen before their worlds went dark. But if he recognized her, if he sensed anything unusual about their interaction, he gave no indication. Your essay was remarkable, he continued. Tell me, what inspired you to write about justice delayed? Bankola met his eyes and smiled with all the innocence she could muster. I believe that some wrongs take time to right, that sometimes justice has to wait for the right person to come along with the right tools to achieve it. But I also believe that when that time comes, justice is always worth the wait. Chief Owumi's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his eyes. Wise words from someone so young. I hope you'll have the opportunity to elaborate on that theme in your presentation tonight. As he moved away to greet other guests, Bankola felt a hand on her shoulder. Grace, wearing a catering uniform, had appeared beside her. "Did you see his reaction?" Grace whispered. "He knows something. Maybe not exactly what, but he suspects. Then we need to move fast. The presentation portion starts in 30 minutes. That's when most of the security will be focused on the main ballroom." "Are you sure about this?" Grace's expression was grim. "I've been sure about this for 3 years. Tonight we find out if the dead can testify." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of nervous conversation and careful observation. Bankola noted the location of exits, the positions of security personnel, and the timing of staff movements through the building. When her name was called for the presentation portion of the evening, she walked to the podium with confidence she didn't feel and began to speak words that would change everything. "Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity to share my vision for justice and women's empowerment." She paused, making eye contact with Chief Owumi, who was seated at the head table. "I want to begin by thanking the man who made tonight possible. The man whose generosity has created opportunities for so many young women. The man whose foundation has touched so many lives." Polite applause filled the room. "But I also want to talk about the young women who can't be here tonight. The ones whose dreams were cut short, the ones whose voices were silenced, the ones who trusted the wrong people with their futures." The room fell quiet. This wasn't the typical scholarship recipient speech about gratitude and opportunity. "I want to talk about a girl named Banker, who died 15 years ago after trusting someone she called a friend, someone who led her to a man who promised her money in exchange for something she could never get back." Murmurs began to ripple through the audience. Chief Owumi's face had gone very still. "I want to talk about Kemi and Funmi and Adayezi and Blessing and dozens of other young women whose names have been forgotten, but whose deaths follow a very specific pattern." Mrs. Adebayo was moving toward the podium, clearly intending to cut the presentation short, but Bankola's voice rose to carry over the growing commotion. "I'm talking about hotel rooms where dreams went to die, about scholarship offers that were actually invitations to disappear, about foundations with golden names but blood-stained floors." Chief Owumi was standing now, his face a mask of controlled fury. "And I want to talk about the man who has spent 15 years getting rich and powerful on the life force he stole from innocent girls who died believing they were alone." Security was moving toward the stage, but Bankola reached into her clutch and pulled out Banker's journal, holding it up for the cameras that were still rolling. This belonged to a girl named Banker Adebayo. She wrote it 3 days before a man named Tukur, who now calls himself Chief Owumi, murdered her for ritual purposes. The room erupted into chaos. Cameras flashed, voices shouted. Security reached the stage just as Bankola opened the journal and began to read. "Something feels wrong about this job, but Amaka says I'm overthinking it. The man organizing it keeps changing his name. First he said he was Mr. Johnson, then Mr. Tukur, then something else entirely." Strong hands grabbed her arms, but not before she had shouted the final words. "I pray that if anything happens to me, someone will remember my name and tell my story. Someone will make sure the truth doesn't die with me." As security dragged her from the stage, Bankola saw Chief Owumi's face clearly for the first time without his political mask. The expression she saw there confirmed everything she had suspected. Recognition, guilt, and fear. The kind of fear that comes from seeing a ghost you thought you had buried walking back into your life 15 years later, demanding justice. The aftermath of Bankola's speech was swift and brutal. She was immediately escorted to a small office behind the main ballroom, where Chief Owumi's head of security, a large man with cold eyes and military bearing, informed her that she would be detained until the police could arrive to charge her with disturbing the peace and making false accusations. "You've made a very serious mistake tonight, young lady," the security chief said. "Chief Owumi is a respected businessman and politician. What you've done could be considered slander." But what he didn't know was that Grace had been watching from the kitchen, and the moment Bankola was removed from the stage, she had activated their backup plan. While the security team was focused on containing the fallout from the presentation, Grace slipped through the service corridors of the building toward Chief Omegu's private office suite. The same route she had used countless times during her years as hotel staff. She knew she had perhaps 10 minutes before someone thought to check the security footage and realized that the girl who had just exposed their boss wasn't acting alone. The office was exactly as she remembered it: opulent, intimidating, designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. But Grace wasn't here as a visitor. She was here as an investigator. The room with the blue curtains was connected to the main office by a private door that Grace had seen Owumi use when he wanted to conduct confidential consultations with scholarship applicants. The door was locked, but Grace had come prepared. 3 years of cleaning luxury hotels had taught her more about security systems than most people learned in a lifetime. The consultation room was smaller than the main office, but somehow felt more ominous. The blue curtains dominated one wall, hanging from floor to ceiling in heavy folds that seemed to absorb sound and light. But it was the filing cabinets that made Grace's blood run cold. 4 large, professional-grade filing systems lined the back wall, each one meticulously labeled with years and regions. 2008 to 2010. Lagos, Abuja. 2011 to 2013. Eastern Region. 2014 to 2016. Northern States. 2017 to present. Expansion phase. Grace opened the first cabinet with hands that shook despite her determination to remain calm. The files were organized with the precision of a medical practice or legal firm. Each folder contained a photograph, a biographical summary, recruitment details, and what appeared to be progress reports tracking the subject's deterioration. The photograph at the front of the first file showed a young woman Grace didn't recognize, but the biographical details made her stomach turn. Mercy Okonkwo, age 19, University of Lagos Engineering. Family financial status, desperate. Recruitment vector, roommate referral. Initial contact, January 15, 2008. The progress reports that followed read like a medical experiment log. Week 1, subject responsive to initial approach, expressed interest in modeling opportunity. Week 3, subject agreed to travel to Lagos, expressed gratitude for transportation and accommodation arrangements. Week 4, ritual completed successfully. Subject returned home with payment as agreed, no immediate complications. Month 2, subject developing expected symptoms, swelling consistent with previous cases. Month 4, subject condition deteriorating as anticipated, family seeking medical intervention. Month 6, subject deceased, cause of death listed as unexplained medical complications, no investigation initiated. Grace forced herself to continue reading, file after file, documenting a systematic pattern of recruitment, exploitation, and murder that spanned more than a decade. But it was in the third cabinet that she found what Bankola would need to prove everything. A file labeled Operational Protocols and Best Practices contained detailed instructions for identifying potential victims, approaching them through trusted intermediaries, and managing the aftermath of their deaths to avoid law enforcement attention. And at the back of that file, a list of names that made Grace's hands shake so violently she almost dropped the documents. Active recruiters, current operations. The list contained more than 50 names, cross-referenced with universities, cities, and recruitment quotas. Young women who were being paid to identify and approach potential victims for what they believed were legitimate opportunities. At the top of the list, marked with a star indicating Senior Recruiter, Exceptional Performance, was a name that explained everything. Annabelle James, formerly Amaka Okafor-Williams, Lagos Operations Coordinator. Grace photographed every page with the digital camera Bankola had given her, working as quickly as possible while trying to comprehend the scope of what she was documenting. This wasn't just evidence of historical crimes. This was evidence of an ongoing operation that was currently targeting young women across Nigeria. She was photographing the final batch of files when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy, purposeful footsteps, security doing a sweep. Grace quickly closed the filing cabinets and moved toward the window, where a service ladder provided access to the building's upper floors for maintenance purposes. She was halfway out the window when she heard the door to the main office open. "Sir, we've secured the girl who caused the disturbance. She's in holding room 3 with our security team. And the investigation into how she obtained that journal." Grace recognized Chief Omegu's voice, and the cold fury in it made her freeze on the ladder. "We're reviewing security footage now, but sir, there's something else you need to know." "What?" "The girl, her name is Bankola Williams. She's the daughter of Senator Williams." There was a long pause before Omegu responded, and when he did, his voice carried a quality that made Grace's blood run cold. "Williams, as in the politician who's been pushing for increased funding for trafficking investigations?" "Yes, sir." "And his daughter just happens to have a journal that supposedly belonged to a girl who died 15 years ago, making accusations that could destroy everything we've built." "Sir, what are your instructions?" Grace didn't wait to hear the answer. She climbed the rest of the way out the window and made her way across the roof toward the fire escape, the camera containing enough evidence to bring down a killer clutched tightly in her hands. Behind her she could hear raised voices and the sound of doors slamming as Chief Omegu's security team began a systematic search of the building. But they were too late. The evidence was already gone, and the truth was about to have a voice louder than anything they could silence. Grace reached the fire escape and began her descent, knowing that everything would change once the photographs on that camera reached the right people. The dead girls were about to get their day in court, and Chief Omegu was about to discover that some secrets are too big to bury. 20 minutes after Grace's escape, as Chief Omegu's security team was still searching the building for signs of additional intruders, Bankola was transferred from the holding room to what was described as a more comfortable location for her interview with the police. The more comfortable location turned out to be Chief Omegu's private conference room, where she found herself face to face with 2 people she hadn't expected to see. The first was Chief Omegu himself, who had traded his politician's smile for an expression of barely controlled fury. The second was a woman Bankola recognized immediately from her dreams, though she looked very different from the university student who had once shared a room with Banker. Annabelle James, formerly Amaka Okafor, was now a polished professional in an expensive suit, with the kind of confidence that comes from years of successful reinvention. But when her eyes met Bankola's, something flickered behind the professional facade. Recognition and fear. "Miss Williams," Chief Omegu said, settling into the chair across from her with the deliberate movements of a predator claiming territory. "I think we need to have a conversation about the serious accusations you made tonight. I think we need to have a conversation about the serious crimes you've committed over the past 15 years, Bankola replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. Annabelle leaned forward, her voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis communications. "Bankola, may I call you Bankola? What you did tonight was very dangerous. You made accusations against a prominent public figure without evidence, in front of cameras and witnesses. That's not just slander. It could be considered criminal harassment. What would you call systematic murder of university students? A career opportunity?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Annabelle's professional composure slipped for just a moment, and Bankola saw the girl underneath. The girl who had once encouraged her roommate to trust a stranger with her life. "I don't know what you think you know," Annabelle said carefully, "but I can assure you that you're mistaken. Chief Omegu has dedicated his life to helping young women achieve their potential, including the potential to die screaming in hotel rooms after being ritually abused." Chief Omegu's hand slammed down on the conference table with enough force to make the water glasses jump. "Enough. I don't know who filled your head with these fantasies, but you're playing a very dangerous game with people who are far more powerful than you understand." Bankola felt the familiar tingling sensation that indicated she was no longer speaking entirely for herself. "I understand power. I understand how it's accumulated, how it's maintained, and how it's lost. I also understand that some power is built on foundations so rotten that a single truth can bring the whole structure crashing down." She turned to look directly at Annabelle. "Don't you, Amaka?" The use of her real name hit Annabelle like a physical blow. Her careful composure cracked, and for a moment the successful PR executive disappeared, replaced by a woman who looked haunted by ghosts she thought she had outrun. I don't know what you're talking about. My name is Annabelle James. Your name is Amaka Okafor. You were Banker Adebayo's roommate at the University of Calabar. You convinced her to go to Abuja for what you told her was an ushering job. You watched her leave for a weekend that would kill her, and when her mother came looking for answers, you looked her in the eye and denied ever knowing her. Annabelle's face had gone very pale. That's impossible. You couldn't know about... There's no way you could know about that. I know because she told me, in dreams, in visions, in moments when her spirit speaks through me to tell the world what you and him did to her. Chief Omegu was watching this exchange with growing alarm. The girl's knowledge was too detailed, too specific. Someone had been talking. Someone had been investigating. Who are you working with? He demanded. Who told you about the university? About the roommate? Bankola smiled with a confidence that belonged to someone much older. I'm working with the dead. And the dead, it turns out, make excellent witnesses. They remember everything. They don't change their stories. And they're very, very patient when it comes to waiting for justice. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, which had been recording the entire conversation. They're also excellent at helping the living gather evidence. Chief Omegu lunged for the phone, but Bankola was faster. She hit the upload button just as his hand closed around the device. Too late. Everything you've said in the last 10 minutes is now backed up to cloud storage and being sent to my father, Pastor Kunle, and several journalists who have been investigating your charitable activities. Annabelle was staring at her with an expression that combined horror and fascination. You really believe she speaks to you? You really think Banker is somehow communicating through you? I don't think it. I know it. Just like I know that you've been helping him recruit girls for the past 4 years. Just like I know that your job as his PR consultant is really a cover for your role as his senior recruiter. That's not... I don't... You do, because you never stopped being the girl who would sacrifice a friend to save herself. You just got better at it. Chief Omegu was pacing now, his political mask completely abandoned. This is a disaster. If that recording gets out... When that recording gets out, Bankola corrected, people are going to start asking questions about your foundation, your scholarship programs, and the unusually high mortality rate among your recipients. She stood up, her small frame somehow commanding the room. They're going to start looking at the connection between scholarship announcements and missing person reports. They're going to start interviewing the families of girls who won your awards and died within 6 months. They're going to start asking Annabelle here about her recruiting quotas and commission structure. Annabelle was shaking now, the weight of 15 years of buried guilt finally catching up with her. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was young, I was desperate, I didn't understand what he was really doing. You understood perfectly. You just didn't care as long as you got paid. That's not true. Then why didn't you stop? Why didn't you report him after you saw what happened to Banker? Why did you help him build a system to make it easier to find and destroy more girls? The questions hung in the air like accusations from a jury of the dead. Before anyone could answer, the conference room door burst open to reveal Senator Williams, Sarah, Pastor Kunle, and 2 police officers. I'm here for my daughter, Senator Williams announced, his voice carrying all the authority of his political office. And these officers are here to investigate some very serious allegations that have just come to our attention. Chief Omegu straightened, immediately shifting back into his public persona. Senator Williams, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Your daughter made some disturbing accusations tonight, but I'm sure we can resolve this quietly. The only thing we're going to resolve, said the lead police officer, is whether the evidence we've just received constitutes probable cause for search warrants. He held up a tablet showing the photographs Grace had taken of the filing cabinets. Someone broke into this building tonight and documented what appears to be detailed records of multiple homicides spanning nearly a decade. Records that specifically implicate you and Ms. James in a systematic pattern of recruitment, exploitation, and murder. Chief Omegu's face went through several rapid transformations. Surprise, calculation, and finally resignation. I want to speak to my lawyer. You'll have that opportunity after we place you under arrest. As the handcuffs closed around Chief Omegu's wrists, Bankola felt a sudden lightness, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. "It's done," she whispered to the empty air. "They know the truth now. Your voice has been heard." For a moment, she could have sworn she heard a whisper in response. "Thank you." And then silence. The peaceful silence of a spirit finally at rest. The arrest of Chief Omegu sent shockwaves through Nigerian political and social circles that reverberated for weeks. Within hours of his detention, the police had obtained search warrants for his properties, his foundation offices, and the financial records of all his affiliated organizations. What they found confirmed Bankola's accusations and Grace's photographic evidence in ways that surpassed even Pastor Kunle's worst fears. The filing cabinets in the consultation room contained detailed records of 127 young women who had been recruited, exploited, and killed over a period of 8 years. Each file told a silent story, a bright face, big dreams, and then a steady, silent collapse. Their lives charted like transactions, their suffering recorded like profit margins. But perhaps most damning were the financial records that showed a direct correlation between the timing of these murders and Chief Omegu's business and political successes. "It's like he was farming them," Detective Inspector Adeyemi explained to the Williams family during a briefing 3 days after the arrest. Each death corresponded with a significant business deal, political appointment, or financial windfall, as if he was somehow converting their life force into tangible success. Sarah, despite her medical training, found herself struggling to process the systematic nature of the crimes. But how is that possible? How could killing someone translate into business success? Pastor Kunle, who had been surprisingly quiet during the official proceedings, finally spoke. "There are practices, ancient practices, that certain people believe can transfer life energy from one person to another. The specifics don't matter. What matters is that he believed it worked, and that belief motivated him to perfect a system for acquiring victims." "And Annabelle? Amaka? What's her situation?" Detective Inspector Adeyemi consulted his notes. "She's cooperating fully with the investigation. Her testimony is providing details about the recruitment networks, the selection criteria, the logistics of how victims were identified and approached. In exchange for her cooperation, the prosecutor is considering reduced charges." Bankola, who had been largely silent since her father's arrival at the foundation that night, finally spoke. "Will her cooperation bring any of them back? Will reduced charges resurrect Bancare or Kemi or Funmi or any of the others?" "No," the detective admitted, "but it might prevent this from happening to other girls." Might isn't good enough. Senator Williams studied his daughter with concern. Since the confrontation with Chief Omegu, she had seemed different. Older, more distant, as if part of her was still processing experiences that belonged to someone else. "Bankola, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that arresting the predator is only half the solution. We also need to address the system that allowed him to operate for 15 years without detection." She pulled out a notebook filled with research she had compiled over the past several weeks. Chief Omegu's foundation wasn't operating in isolation. It was part of a network of supposedly charitable organizations that shared information about potential victims. University administrators who provided student information in exchange for donations. Hotel chains that provided discreet locations for interviews. Transportation companies that specialized in moving young women between cities without proper documentation. Detective Inspector Adeyemi leaned forward with interest. "You're describing a conspiracy involving multiple institutions and potentially hundreds of people." "I'm describing the infrastructure that made it possible for one man to kill 127 young women over 15 years while being celebrated as a champion of women's rights." Pastor Kunle nodded grimly. "The arrests are just the beginning. The real work is dismantling the network that enabled the crimes." Sarah was studying her daughter with growing concern. "Bankola, you sound like you're planning to continue this investigation. But sweetheart, you've done enough. You've exposed the truth, brought justice for Bancare, and potentially saved countless other girls. You can let the professionals handle it from here." "Can I? Can I really walk away knowing that there are recruiters still operating at universities across the country?" that there are girls who received scholarship notifications last week who might be dead by Christmas if someone doesn't warn them. She opened her notebook to a page filled with names and locations. Grace and I have identified active recruitment operations at 12 universities. We've documented the selection criteria they use to identify vulnerable students. We've traced the financial networks that fund their operations. She looked around the room at the adults who were supposed to be protecting her and young women like her. The question isn't whether I can walk away. The question is whether any of us can walk away knowing what we know now. Senator Williams felt a complex mix of pride and terror as he looked at his 15-year-old daughter discussing systematic murder and institutional corruption with the analytical precision of a seasoned investigator. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that we don't let this story end with Chief Omegu's arrest. I'm proposing that we use the media attention from his case to expose the larger network, that we turn this into a national conversation about how these predators operate and how we can protect potential victims. She turned to Pastor Kunle. You have a platform, a television show, a national ministry. You could reach millions of people with the truth about how recruitment works, what warning signs to look for, how to verify the legitimacy of opportunities that seem too good to be true. She turned to her father. You have political connections, legislative influence. You could push for laws requiring background checks for scholarship administrators, mandatory reporting protocols for universities, oversight mechanisms for charitable organizations that work with young women. She turned to Detective Inspector Adeyemi. And you have the authority to expand this investigation beyond Chief Omegu, to follow the money trails, interview the network administrators, dismantle the entire system instead of just arresting the most visible perpetrator. The room fell silent as the scope of what she was proposing became clear. Finally, Pastor Kunle spoke. You're talking about a campaign, a crusade, using Chief Omegu's arrest as the catalyst for a much larger effort to expose and prevent this type of exploitation. I'm talking about making sure that Bancare's death, and the deaths of all the others, lead to systematic changes that prevent future victims. I'm talking about turning tragedy into protection. Detective Inspector Adeyemi was taking notes. The expanded investigation you're describing would require significant resources and political support. It would also put you and your family at considerable risk, since we'd be targeting an entire network of powerful people who profit from these operations. Senator Williams put his arm around his daughter. Bankola, I understand your passion for this cause, but you're 15 years old. You've already done more than anyone could have expected. The adults can take it from here. Bankola shook her head with a determination that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her own personality. The adults had 15 years to figure this out. The adults are the ones who created the systems that enabled these crimes. The adults are the ones who looked the other way, accepted donations from foundations built on blood money, and failed to connect obvious patterns in missing person reports. Her voice carried an authority that made everyone in the room pay attention. Bancare wasn't saved by adults. She was saved by a 15-year-old girl who refused to let her story be forgotten. And the girls who are still alive, the ones who haven't been recruited yet, they're not going to be saved by the same system that failed to protect the ones who are already dead. She closed her notebook and stood up. They're going to be saved by people who remember that every number in Chief Omegu's files was a real person. A daughter, a sister, a friend, someone who mattered. Pastor Kunle was smiling despite the gravity of the situation. You're not just asking us to continue the investigation, you're asking us to start a movement. I'm asking you to honor the dead by protecting the living, and if that becomes a movement, then so be it. The meeting ended with a decision that would reshape all their lives. They would not be satisfied with Chief Omegu's prosecution alone. They would use his arrest as the foundation for a comprehensive campaign to expose and dismantle the networks that enabled systematic predation of young women across Nigeria. It was ambitious, it was dangerous, it was necessary. And it was exactly what Bancare's spirit had been waiting 15 years for someone brave enough to attempt. 3 months after Chief Omegu's arrest, the Nigeria Television Authority invited Bankola to appear on their primetime news program to discuss her role in exposing what the media had dubbed the Foundation murders. It would be her first major television interview, broadcast live to millions of viewers across the country and streamed internationally. The producers had promised her complete editorial control over her statements, recognizing that her story had captured the nation's attention in ways that transcended typical crime reporting. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked as they sat in the green tent behind the studio. "Once you're on that stage, talking to the entire country, there's no taking it back." Bankola was surprisingly calm, though she had been experiencing unusually vivid dreams in the weeks leading up to the interview. Not the disturbing visions that had guided her investigation, but something different. Peaceful conversations with a young woman who looked exactly like her, but spoke with the wisdom of someone who had lived and died and found justice. "I'm as ready as I'll ever be, but I'm not going on that stage alone." "What do you mean?" "I mean that some stories are bigger than the people who tell them, and some truths need more than one voice to be heard properly." Pastor Kunle, who had been praying quietly in the corner, looked up with understanding. "You're planning to channel her, to let Bankare speak directly to the nation." The aftermath of Bankola's television appearance created ripple effects that reached far beyond Nigeria's borders. Within hours of the broadcast, international news organizations were picking up the story. Human rights groups were calling for investigations into similar operations across West Africa. And most significantly, other victims and survivors began coming forward with testimonies that painted a picture of systematic exploitation that spanned multiple countries and decades. Chief Omegu, who had been maintaining his innocence from his jail cell and preparing for what his lawyers claimed would be a successful defense, watched the television interview from the detention facility with growing recognition that his carefully constructed world was collapsing. "She knows too much," he told his lead attorney during their emergency meeting the day after the broadcast. "The details she provided, there's no way she could have researched that information. No way anyone could have told her those specifics. Chief, you need to focus on your defense strategy. Whatever this girl thinks she knows, you don't understand. She described conversations I had with victims 15 years ago. Conversations that took place in private, with no witnesses, no recordings. She described the layout of hotel rooms that were demolished years ago. She quoted things that were said to me by practitioners whose names I never spoke aloud." The lawyer was studying his client with growing concern. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that either this girl has access to investigative resources that surpass anything available to law enforcement, or—" He couldn't finish the sentence, because the alternative, that he was facing supernatural justice administered by the spirits of his victims, was something his rational mind refused to accept, even as his growing fear confirmed its possibility. But the evidence of his exposure was mounting in ways that went beyond Bankola's testimony. The day after her television appearance, police received an anonymous package containing additional photographs from Chief Omegu's files. Not just the documents Grace had photographed, but new material that appeared to have been taken more recently. The photographs showed active recruitment operations, including recent communications between Chief Omegu and his network coordinators. Communications that proved he had been directing operations even from jail. "He's been running the organization through coded messages passed during lawyer visits," Detective Inspector Adeyemi explained to the Williams family, using his legal team as unknowing couriers to coordinate ongoing recruitment efforts. Senator Williams was horrified. "You're saying he was continuing to target young women even after his arrest?" "We're saying he was trying to. The network was designed to operate independently with multiple levels of leadership. Arresting him was like removing the head of a hydra. The body was still functional." "Was?" The television interview changed everything. Once the recruitment methods were exposed publicly, the entire operation became too dangerous to continue. "We've intercepted communications showing that network coordinators are shutting down operations and destroying evidence." Bankola was listening to this briefing with the intense focus she had developed for processing information that might save lives. "But that means some of them are getting away. The recruiters, the logistics coordinators, the financial administrators, they're disappearing before you can arrest them." "Some of them, yes, but we're tracking as many as we can. And more importantly, the public exposure has made it nearly impossible for operations like this to continue functioning." Nearly impossible isn't impossible. Detective Inspector Adeyemi nodded grimly. Which is why we need to continue following every lead, interviewing every witness, and documenting every connection we can find. Your television appearance opened doors that have been locked for years. Meanwhile, in a private medical facility outside Lagos, Annabelle James, formerly Amaka Okafor, was watching the same television interview that was reshaping public understanding of the crimes she had helped facilitate. She had been relocated to protective custody after providing detailed testimony about the recruitment networks, but watching Bankola Channel Bancare's voice on national television had triggered a psychological crisis that required professional intervention. She's really there, Annabelle told her court-appointed therapist. Bancare is really speaking through that girl. I can see it in her expressions, hear it in her voice patterns. It's like she's been waiting 15 years for the chance to tell people what I did to her. Annabelle, you've been under tremendous stress. It's understandable that you might. You don't understand. I knew Bancare better than anyone. I lived with her for 2 years. I know how she spoke, how she moved, how she thought. And that girl on television, she's channeling Bancare perfectly. The therapist was taking careful notes. And how does that make you feel? Terrified, guilty, but also relieved? Relieved. For 15 years, I've been carrying the weight of what I did. Every success I achieved, every dollar I earned, every moment of happiness I experienced, it all felt stolen. Because I knew that I had built my life on Bancare's grave. She was crying now, the carefully maintained composure of the successful PR executive finally cracking under the weight of accumulated guilt. But watching that interview, seeing her have a voice again, seeing people finally understand what happened to her, it's like she's finally been able to tell her side of the story. Do you think she forgives you? Annabelle was quiet for a long moment. I think she's moved beyond forgiveness. I think she's focused on protection now, making sure that what happened to her doesn't happen to anyone else. And what about you? What are you focused on now? I'm focused on making amends, on using what I know about the recruitment networks to help law enforcement shut down as many operations as possible, on testifying against everyone who was involved in these crimes, regardless of how powerful they are or what consequences I might face. She looked directly at the therapist. I can't undo what I did to Bancare. I can't bring her back or give her the life she should have had. But I can make sure that her death leads to justice, not just for Chief Omegu, but for everyone who profited from these operations. Even if that puts you at risk. Especially if it puts me at risk, because risk is what I should have been willing to accept 15 years ago instead of sacrificing my friend to protect myself. The session ended with Annabelle requesting to speak with Detective Inspector Adeyemi about expanding her cooperation to include testimony against individuals who had not yet been identified in the investigation. She was ready to name names, provide evidence, and face whatever consequences came from fully exposing the network she had helped build. It was, she realized, the first truly brave thing she had done since the day she watched Bancare walk into Chief Omegu's trap. And while it couldn't resurrect the dead, it might prevent future deaths, which was, she hoped, enough to begin the process of redemption. 6 months after Chief Omegu's conviction and sentencing to life imprisonment, the University of Calabar held a special ceremony to commemorate the students who had been lost to trafficking operations over the past 15 years. The centerpiece of the memorial was a flowering tree planted in the center of the campus, with a plaque bearing the names of all known victims and a commitment from the university to implement comprehensive safety protocols for student welfare. Bankola, now 16 and preparing for her own university applications, had been invited to speak at the ceremony, but she had requested that the program also include remarks from family members of the victims, testimony from survivors, and presentations from the student safety organizations that had been established in response to the exposed operations. This isn't about me, she told the program organizers. This isn't about my investigation or my television appearances or my role in Chief Omegu's prosecution. This is about making sure that every young woman who walks across this campus knows that her life has value and that people are watching out for her safety. The ceremony drew thousands of attendees, including university officials, government representatives, international human rights observers, and families from across Nigeria who had lost daughters to trafficking operations. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Mama Adebayo, Bankere's aunt who had helped expose Amaka's lies years earlier, approached the memorial tree with a wreath of white flowers. "My niece Bankere was supposed to graduate from this university," she said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "She was supposed to become a doctor. She was supposed to come home and help her community and raise children and live the life she had worked so hard to earn. She placed the wreath at the base of the tree. She never got that chance. But because of her death, because of the courage of young people like Bankola, who refused to let her story be forgotten, hundreds of other girls will get the chances she was denied." The applause that followed was sustained and emotional, but it was interrupted by something that made the entire gathering fall silent. A single white flower had appeared on one of the tree's lower branches. Not budding, not gradually opening, but fully bloomed, as if it had materialized in response to the ceremony taking place around it. Dr. Adebayo, the university's botanical expert, approached the tree with amazement. "This is impossible. This species doesn't bloom white flowers, and it's not the flowering season for this type of tree." But Bankola was smiling with recognition. "It's not impossible, it's just confirmation." She approached the tree and gently touched the white flower. Bankere always loved white flowers. She had white roses in her dorm room, white lilies at her memorial service. This is her way of letting us know that she approves of what we've built here. Pastor Kunle, who had been observing the ceremony from the audience, felt compelled to speak. "Some would call this a coincidence, others might call it a miracle, but I think it's something simpler and more profound." He stood and addressed the crowd. "I think it's a reminder that when we fight for justice, when we protect the vulnerable, when we refuse to let the dead be forgotten, we participate in something larger than ourselves. We become part of a story that connects the past, the present, and the future." He gestured toward the tree with its impossible white flower. And sometimes that story finds ways to remind us that our work has meaning beyond what we can see or measure or understand. In the weeks that followed the memorial ceremony, reports began to circulate of similar white flowers appearing on trees and plants across Nigeria, particularly in locations connected to the investigation or to memorial services for trafficking victims. Botanists and scientists were unable to explain the phenomenon, but families of the victims and survivors of trafficking operations understood it as confirmation that their loved ones' deaths had not been meaningless. The white flowers became a symbol of the movement that had grown out of Bankere's story, a movement dedicated to preventing exploitation, supporting survivors, and ensuring that no young woman would face these dangers alone. Universities across West Africa began establishing white flower safety programs. Law enforcement agencies created white flower task forces dedicated to investigating trafficking operations. And young women across the continent began using white flower imagery to signal their commitment to protecting each other from predators. Bankola, who had started this journey as a 15-year-old girl, haunted by dreams she couldn't understand, found herself at the center of a regional movement that was saving lives and transforming how institutions thought about student safety. But perhaps more importantly, she had found peace. The dreams that had once tormented her sleep had been replaced by quiet conversations with a spirit who no longer needed to scream for justice. Bankere's voice had been heard, her story had been told, and her death had been transformed into protection for others. "Are you ready to move on?" Sarah asked her daughter as they watched news coverage of another trafficking operation being shut down thanks to information provided by survivors who had been inspired by Bankola's example. "I think we're all ready to move on," Bankola replied, though she was looking not at the television, but at a small white flower that had appeared in the vase on their kitchen table. But moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying the lessons forward. She touched the flower gently. "Some stories end with justice, some stories end with healing. But the best stories end with transformation, with the assurance that tragedy has been converted into protection, that pain has been converted into purpose." "And do you think this story has achieved that?" Bankola smiled, her expression carrying both the wisdom of the teenager she was and the accumulated experience of the spirit she had channeled. I think this story has achieved exactly what it was supposed to achieve. Bancare can rest now, the other victims can rest now, and the young women who are still alive have tools and awareness that didn't exist before. She paused, watching the white flower seem to glow in the afternoon sunlight. Some debts can only be paid across generations. Some justice requires more than one lifetime to achieve. But when it finally comes, when the truth is finally heard and acted upon, it's worth the wait. That night, for the first time in more than a year, Bankola slept without dreams of hotel rooms or blue curtains or voices calling for justice. She slept the deep, peaceful sleep of someone whose work was finally complete. 7 years after Chief Omegu's conviction, as Bankola was beginning her first year at the University of Lagos studying criminal justice and human rights, a package arrived at her dormitory address. The package bore no return address, no identifying marks, and had somehow bypassed the university's security protocols for student mail. Inside was a single envelope containing a scholarship notification letter. Congratulations! You have been selected to receive the International Excellence Award for Young Women in Leadership, sponsored by the Owumi Foundation, West African Regional Chapter. Bankola stared at the letter with a mixture of disbelief and cold recognition. Below the official letterhead, someone had handwritten a brief note. Some seeds take time to grow. Some networks take time to rebuild. Some graves refuse to stay closed. We remember you, Bankola Williams. We remember your interference. We remember what you cost us. The network endures. The cycle still feeds itself. We haven't forgotten your interference. With respect and anticipation, the West African Regional Development Initiative. Bankola's hands were shaking as she reached for her phone to call Detective Inspector Adeyemi, but before she could dial, her roommate Folake burst into the room with excitement. Bankola, did you see? I just got the most amazing opportunity. Folake was holding an identical envelope, her face glowing with the kind of hope and excitement that Bankola remembered from her own dreams of university and opportunity. Look, I've been selected for some kind of international leadership program. They're offering full scholarship support, mentorship opportunities, and connections with successful women across West Africa. Bankola felt her blood turn to ice as she read over her roommate's letter. The letterhead was different, the language was more sophisticated, but the underlying structure was identical to the recruitment materials that had lured Bancare and hundreds of other young women to their deaths. Folake, don't respond to this letter. Don't contact these people. Don't do anything until I can have this investigated. What? Why? This is the opportunity I've been waiting for. Do you know how competitive these international programs are? Do you know what happened to the last girls who trusted opportunities that seemed too good to be true? But even as she said it, Bankola realized that 3 years was long enough for new students to arrive who hadn't lived through the media coverage of Chief Omegu's trial, long enough for the specific details of the recruitment methods to fade from immediate memory, long enough for new predators to study what had gone wrong and develop more sophisticated approaches. She looked at the letter in her own hands, understanding that it wasn't really a scholarship offer. It was a threat. A message from survivors of Chief Omegu's network, letting her know that her interference had been noted and would be repaid. But it was also something else. It was a call to action. A reminder that the work she had thought was finished was actually just beginning. That exposing one predator had not eliminated the system that created and supported predators. That night, Bankola called an emergency meeting with her parents, Pastor Kunle and Detective Inspector Adeyemi. She shared the letters, explained their significance, and outlined what she believed was happening. They've learned from Chief Omegu's mistakes. They're operating more discreetly, using different organizational structures, targeting students who aren't familiar with the previous cases. But they've also made a crucial error, Detective Inspector Adeyemi pointed out. They've contacted you directly. They've revealed that they're still operating and that they view you as a threat. Which means they're going to try to eliminate that threat, Senator Williams said grimly. Or, said Pastor Kunle thoughtfully, it means they're about to discover that some threats cannot be eliminated because they're not really threats at all. They're consequences. Bankola understood what he meant. Her role in exposing Chief Omegu hadn't been just about investigation or activism or even justice. It had been about something larger, about the universe's tendency toward balance, toward eventual accountability for those who profit from the suffering of innocence. She looked at the scholarship letter in her hands, reading it not as a threat but as an opportunity. They think they're hunting me, but actually they've just revealed themselves to someone who knows how to hunt them. Bankola, you're 19 years old. You shouldn't have to spend your university years fighting human traffickers. Maybe not. But I also shouldn't have to live in a world where human traffickers can rebuild their operations 3 years after being exposed and continue targeting my classmates and friends. She stood up, her decision made. Banker's story didn't end with Chief Omegu's conviction. It ends when the last person who profits from the exploitation of young women is held accountable for their crimes. She looked around the room at the people who had supported her through the first phase of this journey. And if they want to make this personal, if they want to threaten me directly, then they're about to learn what happens when you threaten someone who has the voices of the dead on her side. That night, Bankola began planning what would become known as the White Flower Investigation, a systematic effort to identify and expose the networks that had survived Chief Omegu's prosecution and were continuing to operate across West Africa. But this time, she wouldn't be working alone. This time, she would be working with an international network of survivors, investigators, and activists who understood that some battles are too important to be fought by any one person. This time, the predators would discover that their prey had evolved. And some graves, once opened, release forces that cannot be contained or controlled or negotiated with. Forces that remember everything. Forces that never stop seeking justice. Forces that grow stronger every time someone tries to silence them. The story of Banker had ended with justice. The story of Bankola was just beginning. 5 years later, Dr. Bankola Williams stood before the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, delivering the keynote address at the International Conference on Combating Human Trafficking. At 24, she had become one of the world's most recognized experts on trafficking prevention, with a doctorate in international criminal justice and a law degree specializing in victim advocacy. But more importantly, she had developed investigative methods that had led to the exposure and prosecution of trafficking networks across 3 continents. The White Flower Investigation had grown into the White Flower Foundation, an international organization that combined traditional law enforcement techniques with innovative approaches to victim identification and network infiltration. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, fellow advocates, she began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to speak truth to power at the age of 15. I want to tell you about a girl named Banker Adebayo, who died 15 years ago believing she was alone, believing her death would be meaningless, believing that the man who killed her would never face justice. The assembly hall fell silent. Bankola's reputation had preceded her, and everyone in attendance understood that they were about to hear testimony that would reshape their understanding of how trafficking operations could be identified and disrupted. Banker was wrong about being alone. She was wrong about her death being meaningless. But she was right to believe that traditional justice systems were inadequate to address the scope and sophistication of the crimes committed against her. She clicked to her first slide, showing a map of Africa with red pins marking locations where trafficking operations had been disrupted using white flower investigation methods. Over the past 9 years, we have documented and helped prosecute trafficking networks in 14 countries. We have identified and supported more than 400 survivors. We have prevented an estimated 1,200 young women from being recruited into exploitation. But more importantly, we have demonstrated that survivors and their advocates, when properly supported and resourced, can achieve investigative and prosecutorial outcomes that exceed what traditional law enforcement can accomplish working alone. She clicked to her next slide, showing photographs of young women who had been recruited into trafficking operations but had been identified and extracted before being harmed. These are the faces of prevention, young women who are alive and safe today because someone remembered Banker's story and recognized the warning signs in time. This is the true measure of justice, not just punishment for crimes that have already been committed, but prevention of crimes that might otherwise be committed. She paused, looking out at the assembly of government officials, law enforcement representatives, and human rights advocates. Banker's voice has been heard by millions of people across multiple continents. Her story has been translated into dozens of languages. Her warning has prevented countless tragedies. But perhaps most importantly, her death has been transformed into a source of protection and strength for young women who find themselves facing the same choices she faced. She clicked to her final slide, showing a white flower against a black background with text that had become the motto of the White Flower Foundation. Some stories end with death. Some stories begin with death. The best stories transform death into life. Banker's story began with her death in a hotel room in Abuja. But it didn't end there. It continued through the dreams and visions of a teenager who refused to let her voice be silenced. It continued through the investigations and prosecutions that followed her exposure. It continued through the policy changes and protection protocols that were implemented in response to those prosecutions. And it continues today, every time a young woman recognizes warning signs and chooses safety over opportunity. Every time a friend intervenes to protect someone from a suspicious offer. Every time an institution implements safeguards to protect vulnerable students. Every time someone chooses to listen to the voices of the dead and act on behalf of the living. The standing ovation that followed lasted for more than 5 minutes, but Bankola's attention was focused on something else. In the assembly hall, scattered throughout the audience, she could see dozens of white flowers. Not real flowers, but small white flower pins being worn by survivors, advocates, and family members of victims who had attended the conference. Each flower represented a life saved, a network disrupted, a predator prosecuted. Each flower represented Banker's voice continuing to echo across the world, continuing to warn and protect and guide. After the conference, Bankola returned to her hotel room to find a message waiting for her. It was from Annabelle James, now doctor. Annabelle Okafor, who had completed her own doctorate in psychology and was working as a therapist specializing in trauma recovery for trafficking survivors. Bankola, I watched your UN address online. I wanted you to know that I think Banker would be proud of what her story has become. I think she would be proud of what you've built in her memory. I also wanted you to know that I think about her every day, not with guilt anymore, but with gratitude. Gratitude that her death led to justice, that her voice found a way to be heard, that her story became a source of protection rather than just pain. I hope someday to contribute to the White Flower Foundation's work in a meaningful way. I hope someday to help save the kind of girls I once helped destroy. Thank you for giving her a voice. Thank you for refusing to let her be forgotten. Thank you for transforming tragedy into triumph. With respect and admiration, Annabelle. Bankola smiled as she read the message, understanding that redemption, like justice, sometimes takes decades to achieve, but is always worth the wait. That night, she dreamed not of hotel rooms or blue curtains or voices calling for justice, but of a young woman with a bright smile and determined eyes, sitting under a flowering tree, surrounded by hundreds of other young women who were alive and safe because someone had remembered her name. In the dream, Banker looked directly at her and smiled. Thank you, she said simply. Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for helping me protect them. Thank you for giving my death a meaning I never could have imagined. When Bankola woke up, she found a single white flower on her bedside table. Not a coincidence, not a miracle. Just a reminder that some voices, once heard, never stop speaking. Some stories once told never stop spreading. Some justice, once achieved, never stops expanding. And some love, once expressed through the protection of others, never stops growing. Banker's story had become larger than Banker herself. It had become a force for change that would continue protecting young women long after everyone who knew her personally had died. It had become immortal. And in becoming immortal, it had achieved the greatest victory possible over the forces that had tried to silence it. The dead had spoken, the living had listened, and the future was safer because of both. This is the end of the Banker trilogy, but it is not the end of the story, because every time a young woman chooses safety over opportunity, every time a friend intervenes to protect someone from danger, every time someone refuses to let the vulnerable be exploited, Banker's voice echoes again. Her story continues in every act of protection, every moment of courage, every choice to value human life over profit. The dead may be silent, but their influence speaks forever. Choose safety, choose wisdom, choose protection. Choose to hear the voices that warn you. Choose to be the voice that warns others. Because in the end, we are all connected by the stories we tell and the protection we offer. And some protection echoes across generations. The end. The dead cannot speak for themselves, but they can speak through us. When we listen to their voices and act on their warnings, we become the echo of their love across time.